Hello ladies and gentlemen, Gapesty here. This is the Heroic Quick Raid Guide for Siegecrafter Blackfuse, the third to final boss in Siege of Orgrimmar. And as always, if you want the full raid guide, which will have a lot more detail on this fight, you can click on the raid annotation on the bottom left, or the tank, healer, or DPS buttons there to check out role-specific guides for this fight. So to begin, let's talk a bit about the addition on Heroic, which is Overcharge weapons. And technically this is just one new ability, but it takes on 4 different manifestations during the fight. The basic idea is that when your assembly team destroys one of the weapons on the assembly line, and the 2 remaining weapons that spawn on the other side, one of them will become overcharged by the boss. And the target that is overcharged has new abilities that will occur while that overcharge is active that make the fight significantly more difficult. The way that Overcharge is selected can be a little bit complicated. I won't go into the full details of it. You can check out the full raid guide for that specific detail, but the basic idea is that Overcharge weapons are selected based on the weapon that's highest in the priority list. There is a priority list of weapon order for Overcharge. And it will select the highest priority weapon that has the lowest total number of overcharged applications throughout the fight up to that point. So if every weapon has already been overcharged one time, the same number of times, the next available weapon with the highest priority in the priority list will be overcharged next. That's the basic idea. So you can use this information to order the overcharged weapons throughout the fight and basically come up with an assembly line kill order or strategy for your raid based on what you want to do. So the first overcharge that we're going to talk about is shockwave missiles. So there you can see in the top of the screen is an overcharged shockwave missile. This causes the shockwave missiles that spawn to basically be targetable and killable. And once you kill a particular shockwave missile, it will cease to spawn additional missile waves that it normally would. However, if you leave a targetable missile active for too long, it will just continue to spawn new waves over and over until it's killed. So basically the missile just needs to be killed quickly by your DPS and it will cease to spawn waves, and then the next missile will spawn. And just like normal missiles, there are 3 overcharged missiles in each set. Next we have overcharged lasers. So here you can see waves of lasers that spawn in 3 sort of full concentric circles in specific spots around the room. And there are gaps at specific areas in each of the rings that allow you to run through them if you want. So here you can see a top-down diagram we used for some of our strategy stuff that shows you where the gaps are, but they're roughly kind of opposite where the assembly line is on the other side of the room, with the exception of the centermost ring. So when these spawn, you need to be in positions that basically allow you to safely avoid where the lasers are occurring. And you can use either the gaps between laser paths or just the specific openings in each specific ring or concentric circle. The next overcharge is for the magnet, which sort of causes a continuous push and pull pattern to occur. So unlike the normal magnet, which just sucks everything in, all the saw blades once, and it's done, Overcharge magnet causes this push and pull pattern to keep occurring. And this means that players need to avoid the saw blades that are being thrown at them, which will spawn or fan out in sort of a fan pattern based on the number of saw blades that are there. And while they're doing that, of course, avoid the push and pull causing them to move into other mechanics and stuff. It'd be pretty difficult. There's also some continuous damage that occurs during the magnet phase that you just have to heal through. And then the final overcharge that you'll see is for crawler mines. And the crawler mines, the overcharged versions are larger versions of the mines. And when an overcharged large mine is killed, it will spawn 2 smaller normal mines from its positions. So here you can see the mine dying, and then the overcharged mines, or excuse me, the smaller mines, the crawler mines, not the overcharged ones, will appear basically where the larger one was killed. So in total, overcharged mines basically has a about 3 times as many mines in total to deal with for that set. But otherwise, they act just the same as the normal version, so they can be stunned and slowed and killed off with ranged DPS, ideally. So next, you want to just consider the basic assembly order that will occur on the assembly line. So I won't read through this full list. You can check it out in your own time at your leisure. But there you see a chart that just shows the assembly line count, so whichever assembly line wave you're dealing with, and then the 3 weapons that will be on that assembly line for that particular count. So with this information, you can, of course, just plan ahead for your overall strategy and which target you want to kill for any given assembly line section. This will be, of course, useful for the DPS assigned to dealing with the assembly line. Another thing worth briefly mentioning is how you handle shredders. So obviously this is mostly up to your tanks, but the basic idea is to determine how many stacks of the electrostatic charge that you want your tanks to get to when they're tanking the boss to help them with the shredders. So there are a number of possible methods, but the easiest one we found that worked really well was to use 3 or 4 stacks on your tanks as appropriate. Generally, the tank with the lowest DPS will go up to 4 stacks, and the tank with the highest DPS just stays at 3 stacks. So that's what we did, and it worked really well. Our monk tank that can kill the shredders a little bit faster than our paladin tank would only get 3 stacks of the debuff, while as a paladin tank would just go up to 4. And with 4 stacks, it allowed him to easily deal with the shredder in time, basically, and not allow it to use its overload ability and kill the raid too frequently. So you'll have to experiment with your tanks, and particularly based on their burst DPS to handle the shredders. But 3 or 4 stacks should be sufficient now that the shredders have their health reduced, basically, a little bit. Okay, so let's talk a bit about these potential strategies that your raid can use for this fight. And again, these are all basically revolving around the assembly team's kill order, which then determines which weapons are overcharged for the rest of the raid. So there's a lot of information that's thrown up on the screen there. I'm not going to read through it all. You can do it at your own leisure. And I talk about all of this in much more detail in the full raid guide for those sections if you want that. But on the left there, the basic idea shows you which kill target you are killing off in the assembly line. So assembly 1 is mine, 2 is mine, and so on. And overall, you're just killing mines for this anti-mine strategy so that you don't have to deal with mines on the main platform except for on wave 6. There are pros and cons, of course, to this method, like any. But the overall basic benefit to this strategy is that if you have a decent amount of melee DPS, which have a very difficult time dealing with mines because mines will target melee just as well as ranged, this strategy is really the only one you can use because it has the fewest number of mines. So while this presents the problem of dodging missile waves primarily along with everything else, it's really your best or only hope if you have a decent amount of melee DPS in your raid group. So positioning for this strategy is basically your raid hangs out on the left side of the room near the assembly line the whole time and does their best to dodge all the basic mechanics as well as the overcharge stuff. So the lasers, the magnet push-pull, and primarily the big danger is the waves from the missiles. So practicing dodging the waves is going to be the most important factor in getting this strategy down properly. And as I said, you get 1 set of overcharged mines on Assembly 6, which cannot be avoided. So it's important that your raid members are ready for that and use their stuns and their snares and range DPS to kill those off when they pop up. The second possible strategy is anti-missiles. And so as you might imagine, just like the mines where you're trying to avoid overloaded or overcharged mines, the same thing occurs here. You're trying to avoid overcharged missiles with this strategy. And so again, there's all the information on screen. You can read through it or get more information in the full guide. But the basic idea is you kill missiles every time you can on the assembly line, so you don't have to deal with missile waves at all on the main platform. The one exception is that on wave 11, you'll get the first and only set of overcharged missiles that you have to deal with. But For the most part, that's really not a concern because the fight should be over by then. So the main benefit to this method is that you have no overcharged missiles to attack. You will still get missile waves, but since you don't have to move into position to deal with the overcharged missiles that spawn, it's significantly easier to have sort of static positions around the room. And the only time you have to move during this strategy is basically to get in position for the overcharged lasers, which you should know ahead of time, or to get in side positions away from the fan that will occur when the magnet push-pulls all the saw blades. So I don't have any footage of it, but the overall positioning for the raid for this strategy for anti-missiles is opposite the assembly line, so opposite of where we are here, toward the other belt that's on the other side of the room, where the shredders spawn and where the weapons charge up and all that stuff. From that position, you can stand far to the right or far to the left, or even behind, right up against the other assembly line, to avoid the saw blade fans that are being pulled and pushed during the magnet phase. So again, there's more detail in the other video if you want more about it. But the basic benefit to this method is the lack of overcharged missiles. But the downside is that you have to kill tons and tons of mines. So if you have very heavy range DPS, this strategy's just fine. But if you have any decent number of melee DPS, as I mentioned before, you really can't use this method because there will be too many mines to deal with, and melee won't be able to help that much. So a few tips to handle the overcharged weapons. We'll start with magnets here. The main difficulty here, of course, is that since it constantly pushes and pulls you, you need to adjust your positioning at all times to not get hit by other mechanics. And depending on your strategy, dodging the missile waves during this can be particularly difficult. You also have to avoid the saw blades that are flying in and out. So you can stand on the very outside ring of the room, because the saw blades do not go that far. They stop just short of it, as you see there. Or you can just stand somewhat in more and then just dodge the saw blades as they're coming in. So keeping your camera zoomed out will help you a lot with that. Now, to avoid overcharged lasers, this is really just a matter of knowing where the circles are going to spawn just before they're appearing and getting in safe positions prior to that actually happening. So this just mostly takes practice and maybe some raid markers to kind of get down easily enough. But the basic idea here is you can see that I'm just hanging out on the second outermost sort of safety ring between the two overcharged lasers rings there. And from this position, I can safely melee the boss, and also it will allow me to be pretty far from the saw blades so I can dodge them as they're flying out. So this is, again, the overall strategy is find a safety gap between the overcharged laser paths before they actually appear, and you can hang out there throughout the duration of it. Now, for overcharged missiles, and even regular missiles to some degree, the basic idea is that you can force the missiles to sort of spawn near your raid. Basically, a missile will initially spawn in a quadrant that is occupied by a random raid member. So if you have all your raid members in particular quadrants or sections of the room, the first missile in a given trio or set will always spawn near one of those raid members. Anyway, the biggest thing you can do to help yourself is have your camera zoomed out really far and always be conscious of the current set of waves that are flying out, where they're coming from what angle, and basically the distance or gap between given waves so that you can position appropriately so that a wave will easily be avoidable by you. So there you can see after the first wave spawned from that missile, I'm able to step between the second wave and the overcharged laser path that's on the outside. In that small gap there's enough room to stand safely. So learning those sort of tricks will help you a lot. And otherwise you're just standing on the outside edge of a wave. Once it goes off, you step through on the inside and you're safe from that set until the next one comes along. And then finally we have overcharged mines. And I talked a bit about handling those before, but I don't have much footage of it since we tried to avoid mines. But the best thing you can do really is to drop snares, ground-based snares, under the positions that the mines are either spawning at, if you're using the anti-missile methods, you're already over where they're spawning, or the paths that they're going to path through if you're not using that strategy. So here we drop our snares kind of in the center, and then force the mines to pass through that center section, so they're slowed down a bit. Also, both the overcharged and the smaller mines can be stunned, so make sure you use all your stuns when available, preferably your AE stuns that hit multiple things. And otherwise, your ranged DPS will have to focus on the mines exclusively while they're active until they're all dead. So I believe that covers everything for the quick raid guide for Heroic Siegecrafter Blackfuse. It's a very difficult fight, easily the most difficult up to this point, and maybe even beyond it in this tier. And it's really just going to come down to practice. So once your raid settles on the appropriate strategy for your group, just stay confident knowing that that's the best method for your group, and then just practice, practice, practice. As I said, the key components for people not dealing with assembly line primarily are keeping your camera zoomed out and being very aware of your surroundings at all times, knowing where you should move to avoid various mechanics like the saw blades that are flying out, the lasers that are spawning, and the missile waves that are occurring. And once you get some practice down with that, and then knowing when to use your survival cooldowns if you can't avoid something, things will fall into place much faster. So, as always, good luck, thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed, please subscribe.